Recently, Oakland Socialists had a chance to talk with the newly elected president of CWA Local 7250 in Minneapolis, Kieran Knutson. Kieran is also a longtime union activist and also a longtime anti-racist activist. Also joining the conversation was Cheryl Zuer, who has a similar activist background, and Cheryl had been the president of Ask Me Local 444 here in Oakland, California. How's it going today, Kieran?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for taking the time. So this is a new role in life for you as president of the local, huh?
Yeah, it is.
How's
What
things
did I get
going?
myself into?
Kieran talked a little bit about his background activities in the CWA over the last few years.
And I had been part of kind of a sometimes formal and sometimes informal sort of democratic opposition movement within the local over many years. And so people knew me through that. And then also through my role as a chief steward, we were really able to build a steward force in the call center that I worked on. And not only add a whole lot of stewards to it, like triple its size, but also really its composition. So it went from being almost all white male to being majority women, majority people of color, majority Black. And I think that helped change how people viewed the union, because people tend to see it as this outside force, right? Or this outside entity. And so I think we broke that down successfully, at least to a large degree, and also really made it much more available to everybody, no matter what their gender or nationality, ethnicity. And I think that for those reasons, I think people were willing to saw some of the things that I was saying, and it wasn't just me, but that several folks were saying about the direction of the local, and also the person that had been the president had been sort of a long-term, president, like nearly 20 years in the position. And so I think people were both looking for a change, and then were excited about the possibilities, about the things that we were talking about in our campaign.
How did your longtime activism in the anti-racist movement play into that?
Well, I think a couple ways. One is you just learn some organizing skills when you're in a movement. For a good part of my life, it really took in to heart that working class unity is dependent on opposition to racism, and that has to be fundamental to what we're doing. But it's about trying to really take on racism as it comes up, and to be clear that it's not only an attack on Black folks or whatever community is under attack or whatever individuals under attack, but it's an attack on the class as a whole. And so it's important for all of us to stand up against it. And I think I'm for sure I'm not a perfect person. I'm living in this society just like all of us, but I think that I do take that seriously. So I try and live that. And, I think I think a lot of times people are like that approach. They think that's right. And that should be how unions are. And so I think that undoubtedly played a role in it too.
Kieran talked about what it means to be president of a local, including some of the political dangers involved.
There's a whole bunch of sort of administrative work that I think it became easy for me to see how somebody who is sincere and maybe has some commitment to some, we'll say, big picture ideas can get overwhelmed by the little details, and sort of the big ideas or the big picture ideas get pushed to the background. And so what I'm doing is trying to, one is really democratize and decentralize some of that work, both for my own sanity, but also to spread the power around. That's something that I would tell people about if someone else was running, was to try and be prepared, and also to really have a team of people that you can rely on, because my approach is not to act like I know everything. In fact, I ask a lot of questions because I don't. And I'm lucky that I have friends and allies that are on the executive board who've been really helpful in trying to figure out some of that stuff. Same time, I have to be conscious of the fact that if I'm taking myself off the clock, so to speak, all the time, I'm going to lose connection to the rest of the workers who have to punch in and take calls and take payments and do all the sorts of things that our job is. And so, that's something I have to figure out. And I want to try and maybe commit myself to a certain amount of hours per week or something like that, so that I'm still, part of the workforce. That's something that's important to me. Probably like my summation of the labor movement is that there is, that it's basically run by a bureaucracy that is privileged and removed from, most of the working class, and actually has some investment in the system as it is now in a way that other working class people don't necessarily have. And so that has, it's not the only reason for the lack of, workers' struggle in this country, but it's certainly one of the factors. That doesn't mean that every person in a union office is necessarily an enemy or something, but I think that just shows the setup. This is the system. This is where it's at right now.
Kieran talked about the AT&T retail stores, where the workers are union, but that came about just through an easy card check without AT&T really fighting it. Those workers tend not to be the typical CWA members. They tend to be younger and also more in the salesperson mode. And also, the union has by and large ignored them. Kieran explains how AT&T is now moving to bust the union and drive down the wages in those stores.
They're closing the corporate-owned retail stores and flipping them to non-union, third-party outsourced stores with the same branding, often in the same exact storefront that the corporate store had been in. And the workers then are no longer AT&T employees; they're employees of one of these outsourced, third-party companies. And it's not just like they're franchising to a mom and pop or something. There's a couple of really big companies that exist solely, as far as I can tell, to be these kinds of third-party outsourcing groups for AT&T. And the workers are paid much less, like $10 an hour. They have, very little benefits. And then there's, one thing I learned is that they also don't, their staffing is very unsafe. So they'll often staff people by themselves. And I was talking to a young woman who used to work in these outsourced authorized retailers, as they call them. And, she described being robbed at gunpoint, for all the stuff in the store. And she had another friend in a different store that was tied up in the back, and the store was robbed, because they were working by themselves, and, in our stores, you're always working with someone else.
Kieran explained how the CWA nationally is doing very little about this major threat to people's jobs. His local, however, did picket a local AT&T store that was bilingual and therefore served an important community service also. They got support for that picket from other unions and also from some people of color community groups, which Kieran and members were quite happy about. They also submitted a resolution to the state council saying that the CWA would not support any candidate for office who was not firmly committed to opposing this sort of outsourcing. Unfortunately, the only delegates who supported the resolution were delegates from a local that represents manufacturing workers in a small manufacturing plant. Kieran also discussed the activities of CWA Regional Council 7.
To me, it just comes off like an appendage of the Democratic Party. They're very explicit that the main priority of the union is to get Joe Biden's agenda passed, and particularly the PRO Act, which they see as a panacea of everything that's needed. And this relates to a conversation I had many years ago with a vice president of CWA who was retiring, an international vice president was retiring, and was at a district meeting, and everybody was just kind of giving him, plaudits for his career and all that. It was a question and answer session, but it was mainly people standing up and saying how great he was. But I asked him, I said, and it was during a contract campaign. So I asked him, I said, it doesn't seem like we have a plan to go on strike. And I said, I know that we can't just go on strike willy-nilly, but it seems like we need a plan, in case we do need to go on strike, and also to make us look stronger, because you can only do so much mobilizing, And so I said, it seems like we don't have a strike. Can you tell me that I'm wrong? And he said, no, you're not wrong. We don't have a plan to go on strike. And he said, we don't think we can win strikes until the government changes. And I actually have, the opposite, which is that I don't think government's going to change unless people are out in the street fighting, and winning on strike and organizing. And I think that's one of the big differences. The bureaucracy, the union officers, the union officialdom really is invested in, the political system in the United States. And I think that it's obvious to me anyways, the way the lay of the land is, not much is going to, with the way the Senate is and the way the House is. And I think that it's, these big things they think are going to get through, it does not look like it's going to happen. But yet that's still the main focus, instead of organizing, workers and going on strike.
We asked Kieran about linking up with the rank and file of other locals in order to bring about the necessary changes in the union as a whole.
So it's important to have some kind of example that you can point to, even if it's a partial thing, or even if it's just sort of showing some possibilities. So I think we're going to try and create that. And then the other thing is that there actually is a basis to build something, because over the last 10 years, maybe over the last, let's say, 6 or 7 years, there's been a bunch of grievance strikes that have happened in AT&T by CWA locals. So we want to start trying to publicize what we're doing and make connections with, workers all over the country, in our industry and other industries. And particularly, I think we want to build with other locals that are interested in fighting.
Cheryl Zuhr, former president of AFSCME Local 444, talks about her experiences in that office and how she and her local reached out beyond that local.
And I also want to say, Kieran, I can completely relate to your description of being president of the union and other things. Even though it was a while ago that I was president, I was active for many years in the local as a steward. I was the newsletter editor and other positions. So I had been very involved in the union before I was elected president. But so we negotiated a contract in 1997. And I don't know if you remember what was going on in the United States in 1997, but it was the Clinton decade. It was the decade of the downsizing of government. It was the decade of attacks on public sector unions and on public sector workers in general. And the response of the public sector unions, especially ours, AFSCME, was to completely, all of the unions embraced the concept of the team concept, which was that we had as much at stake in the game as our employers did. So therefore, we're on the same team. We all have something to lose here, and we all have something to gain. So we're going to help you. We're going to help you decide how many jobs to cut, things like that. I know you're familiar with this. So, but what we decided, so we represented the blue collar workers at a water utility, the largest water agency in this area. And the transportation workers were under attack, were negotiating contracts. Everybody was facing major setbacks. So we decided to set up what we called a public sector alliance. And during our negotiations, and it was also after Clinton had passed the welfare reform. And so we reached out to community organizations that were fighting for more jobs as a response to welfare reform. And we reached out to other public sector unions saying that we have all these things in common. We want to fight to maintain and improve our benefits. We want to fight for more jobs in the public sector at large. So that was our approach. We had very, very limited success with the public sector unions for all the reasons you can guess. That was not what they were in. They weren't interested in organizing their own members to fight back, and they certainly weren't interested in really working in a meaningful way with community organizations. But that was our approach, and it certainly was a popular approach with our members who saw the power in it. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very, very successful contract negotiation. We did not take anything off the table, and we did not accept any single takeaway. Mm-hmm. And we could have gotten more. And at the final meeting where the contract was ratified, we told our members, we said, we are willing to go further. We are willing to continue to fight, but only if you are willing to go further. If you're not willing to do anything more, then you should vote yes on this contract. But if you are willing to fight and we have a plan, and here's what our plan is, then let's go on. So they accepted the contract, but it was with a true sense of solidarity that was very, very powerful and palatable to the membership that stayed for a time. So that's a little bit about that. I wanted to just make one suggestion to you about this real challenge that you're facing in staying connected with your members, which is really tough because, of course, you're drawn into meetings and your management knows that. Like, let's get him away as much as possible from his base, and then we can get a hold of him and shape him. So one of the things that we did was, whether you're in negotiations or not, you can set up targeted shop floor meetings. And maybe you're already doing this. It sounds like that is your orientation. But I think that's really important, especially departments or areas that are in a real struggle. Well, you've already talked about these storefronts. That was fascinating. Really appreciate your explaining that whole situation. But, set your priorities and then meet with those stewards and set up targeted meetings to give the members a chance to say, here's what's going on. Here's what we need. And maybe you can't go to all those meetings, but some of the other officers can, and you go to the most important ones.
Right.
That's one thing you could do.
Good suggestions. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think your example is a good one too, of trying to make that united front of different public sector unions. Thanks.
We asked Kieran a little bit more about working with the other locals in the area and also with the membership of other locals.
We're still figuring out how that piece will work, and I'm still trying to figure out, but I think we need to spread the message of what we're doing, and we need to find people that are wanting to do that.
Kieran returned to the issue of the potential store closings of AT&T and who it is, what sector of the working class actually works in those stores, and the issue of trying to build the union power there.
I think we're all kind of aware of that urban-rural divide in the working class right now. And so these stores actually put us outside of just the metro area, but put us in smaller towns around the state. My experience right now, though, is that when we go into these stores, that there isn't an indifference and hostility to the union. And I think instead there's like sort of a curiosity and sort of an enthusiasm about the idea of a union. Not that they're necessarily feeling it or participating in it yet, but that they'd like to, and that the idea of being in a union is something that interests them. And so that, to me, I think is not down to my stellar personality, but is down to changes in the world, that are going on, and that there's something in the air right now in terms of people feeling like they want to be part of some kind of collective fight back, So our goal is to try and get a steward in every store, and to connect those stewards in a network so that they're able to communicate with each other. They don't have to go through me. They can talk to each other directly, and to start, sharing their concerns, start sharing information, because sometimes something will go down in a store and they're unclear whether it's just a particular manager that's pushing it or whether it's a policy across the board that's being pushed. And by having the stewards be able to talk to each other, we can figure that kind of stuff out further. And it just sort of, builds the power and the the control over the union from the workers. So I'm sort of excited about that. I do like doing it. Yesterday I was out in 3 different stores, and one of them we'd already recruited, 2 of them we'd already recruited stewards, and the third one, I think we have somebody on board now.
That Kieran's description of what you're doing, just brought up the fact that, the defeat of the union in Bessemer and why that happened. And would you like to talk about that a little bit? About your take on it?
I would, but I'd love to hear your take on it too.
Okay, well, all we have is access to information mainly through Payday and Mike Elk. And I thought his article was excellent, and I totally agree with it. And of course, it may be that this is the Waterloo or something that it's sort of been exposed now to further maybe than it's ever been before, that the reason that these union campaigns in the South continue to be defeated, and other places too, is because card check doesn't work. And people in the situation that they're in places like Bessemer, Alabama, are not going to risk everything they have for something that is not doing anything for them, that they see no good reason to. People are just like, so the combination of the anti-union campaigns with a combination of the union not building a base in the plant, not fighting for people on the job for a long period of time ahead of time, it's not going to work. Right. So the question is whether or not, how far that lesson will go and what will happen next. But what you're talking about going to these storefronts is, imagine if every union across the country was using that general approach. We would have, the union movement would not be tanking. Right. It would be going in a different direction. But of course, that's not their approach because, we all know why. Card check and just bring in those dues and we don't do anything for you. So,
I agree. I don't know enough about what it looked like sort of on the ground in Alabama, but my sense, is that everything was really this sort of like that whole professional staffer approach that just dominates everything. And so like there's this sort of internal world of staffers that agree on what successful organizing looks like, even though there's no evidence or very little evidence of it, in the real world. And it's really, PR driven, so there's big push to have all these politicians make a statement or to have celebrities show up. And I think you're right. Like probably people will be happy to shake hands with a celebrity, but they have to think about their check, I think that's really what it comes down to. And then the other thing is like, if so much is based on these NLRB elections, so if the unions are really committed to building somewhere, let's just start building, let's start building collectives of workers, even if it's some of it might have to be underground at first, some of it might have to have kind of a mutual aid society type of approach at first, and education, but if you're there and you're committed to being there for the long run, then it's not sort of like this whole like dog and pony show, and then pull out when shit doesn't go the way you want it to.
I think a lot also has to do, you were saying, and I've heard this dozens of times from union leaders, well, we can't win strikes anymore. But it's not just the leadership. I've heard members saying that also. Right. And it's half of a truth, which, as you know, is even more dangerous than a total lie. Right. The other half of the truth is we can't win strikes anymore using the tactics that we've been using. That's right. And we have to return to the methods of the 1930s. But since those methods are largely unknown in the main and not thought about to the membership, then they stop at half of it. And so what is the point of risking everything that you have? Basically, if you are in a union that's committed not to going on strike, which is what it boils down to, what's the point in being in a union? So I
And there's no
think
good examples.
the other half of the issue is it's
Mhm.
not just what you're doing or not doing in the organizing. I don't mean obviously you. I mean the labor leadership as a whole. Is what they're doing in the labor movement as a whole that creates a certain
Yeah.
attitude and a certain consciousness that doesn't only exist amongst the union members, but
Mhm.
within the working class as a whole.
Yeah. One of the things I think within the class is that people, they don't see strikes winning, and there's a strike. Um, and so people, it makes sense to sum that up, that it's not I think people think sometimes you have to morally go on strike, because you just can't accept it any longer, but they don't necessarily see that as like a path to strengthening our power, which is what it's supposed to be, right? And I see it all the time, that slogan, which I hate, the one day longer idea, that we're just gonna somehow outlast the capitalists, that we're gonna be able to sort of, in the staring contest, that we're gonna be able to win, which is totally makes no sense, since they have all the money and we don't. We're never gonna be able to win those kinds of things. So it has to be, it has to be decisive. It has to be, sharp, and it has to involve a lot of people, and it has to take some risks. I think that's part of it. But the other side of it is that thing I was describing about something in the air, where I think people really want to see somebody fight back. And just like the Minneapolis uprising, the George Floyd uprising that happened, like in the first few days after that, there was a poll that was something like, is the anger justified, I think was the way it was phrased. And the overwhelming, something like 80% of respondents said it was. And this was at a time when, buildings were burning and stores were being looted. But I think people understood that people had had enough, and sort of appreciated the fact that regular people were all of a sudden in control of the narrative, even if they didn't necessarily agree with every little thing that happened. And I think that's true of a big, powerful strike too. That if there was a big, powerful strike that really shook things, that a lot of people would be cheering for it to win.
When was the last time we saw a big win for a union?
Right.
Does anybody remember? I mean, all people see is defeats, one after another. So why would there be any confidence? I mean, on a national scale, I mean, in the national news. And until that changes, and how will that change? Because until the tactics change, until there is much more of a larger rank and file movement fighting to take back the union leadership, and to take it in a totally different direction of actually fighting to organize the members and rebuild a true class consciousness, because we know that's missing as well. But yeah.
Here's where the two issues kind of merge in my mind is, for a big, powerful strike, for a strike to become big and powerful, it has to have support from the wider working class community. And that ties up, you mentioned at the period after George Floyd was killed. And we've seen these protests you've been involved in them, I have been, Cheryl has, for years and years and years, in Ferguson, and yet in all of that time, the labor movement has been almost 100% absent. And so that's the other issue, is how do you see using your role as president to try to get the labor movement more directly involved as a labor movement in these issues? And you're really being in Minneapolis, kind of in ground zero on that right now.
Yeah, I think that we have to talk about what would the uprisings have looked like if the unions had participated wholeheartedly in it. And I think that that's something we have to figure out. Okay, what would that look like, or what would at least the first steps of that look like? There are so many, there's a union hall not far from the 3rd precinct, which is kind of the ground zero of where the uprising really began. And They boarded up their windows just like all the other small businesses in the area, right? In the day of the protest started. So instead of like opening up the hall, letting people use the bathroom, having a place to go, maybe maybe let medics set up there, for people who got tear gas, or maybe giving out water, playing music, just maybe being, instead the young people probably just saw it just the same way they saw any of the other businesses that were boarding up their windows, and I think that we have to think about, what would it look like for the unions to be a part of that. And part of it, obviously is taking a strong stand, against racism, against police brutality, and trying to find ways for us to participate in a meaningful way. So I think the trial is going to be over soon, and we'll see what happens with that. But I do think there needs to be something in the works for unions to take a strong stand, hopefully not just one or two locals, but a number of locals, and really to not just do it on paper, but to try and bring out people on the street and stuff. So
this brings us to the end of the first half of the discussion with Kieran Knutson. We see in this discussion how labor action on the job, strikes, organizing, and so on, is intimately tied up with political action, with actions in society as a whole, including, of course, struggle against racism. In the second half of this interview, we will discuss more the political activity of the unions, including the question of support for the Democratic Party.